Ever since starting this channel, one series I've always wanted to cover is The Legend of Zelda. From its iconic characters, wonderful music, and fantastic settings, ever since I was a kid, I've always held this series close to my heart. My first experience with the Zelda series came in the form of Zelda 2 on the GBA, believe it or not. I remember exploring the overworld, being amazed at the scope of the game because I was able to explore anywhere I wanted. I would always follow the road leading to the cave, but when I was unable to see where I was going, I decided to leave the cave and travel south to the town of Rauru. There I talked to the townsfolk and eventually found an old man who taught me the shield spell. So now I was able to stand a chance against the enemies who were otherwise kicking my ass. Eventually, I braved my way through the cave and arrived at the other side. I saw the first palace but decided to head south where I had a platform over bottomless pits and dodged those deadly bubbles. At the end, I found a heart container increasing my max HP. From then on, I learned that exploration would lead to rewards. Once I entered the first palace, I realized that the cave was only a warm-up for what I was about to experience. Not only were the enemies more challenging, but the layout was designed to be a maze. However, remembering to explore like previously, I ventured deeper and discovered keys allowing me to explore previously locked areas, and a candle which proved to be useful on my return trip. I also farmed the skull enemies because I realized they gave a ton of XP for early in the game. Once I made my way to the boss, I noticed his armor shielded his body from damage, but his head was where he was vulnerable. Making sure to dodge his attacks, I managed to defeat him and place the gemstone on the statue, completing the first palace. What I'm trying to get at with this story is that up until that point, I had never played a game like Zelda before. At the time, I was used to games telling me what to do, marking a destination on my map, and following the cursor until I had to do it again. While Zelda has never been a true non-linear series up until the release of Breath of the Wild, the games make it very clear on where you need to go, but the journey to get there is left up to the player. I never ended up beating Zelda 2, but I would always replay that opening part time and time again. My next experience came with Phantom Hourglass on the DS, and the same reasons I said about Zelda 2 applied to Phantom Hourglass. Only this time I got to experience the high sea sailing from Wind Waker. Next came Spirit Tracks, an underrated Zelda game if I might add, then Twilight Princess on the Wii, and by Twilight Princess I was pretty much a certified fan. Skyward Sword came after that, and finally I got to experience Ocarina of Time thanks to the 3DS version. Recently, I completed my first playthrough of the Oracle games, and in my free time, I'm currently playing the GameCube version of Twilight Princess. I wanted to share those stories to highlight how much I cherish this series for this review retrospective. To go over the origin of the Zelda series, The Legend of Zelda once again shares its creator with Shigeru Miyamoto, who you'll remember also created the Mario series. As a young boy, he would often spend his time exploring the forest and nearby countryside of his hometown of Kyoto. When he later began working as an artist for Nintendo and found success after creating Super Mario Bros., he and Takashi Tezuka, who you'll also remember helped develop the first Mario game, wanted to create an action-adventure fantasy game that put exploration and secrets at the forefront. The series' main protagonist, Link, was stated in interviews to be heavily inspired from Peter Pan. While with his green clothes and being aided by fairies, his name comes from the idea that he's meant to serve as the link between him and the player. Link is the quintessential silent protagonist. He never speaks barring grunts or battle cries. However, it doesn't mean that Link isn't a character of his own. Oftentimes, he communicates using non-verbal cues, and later games would define more of his personality. The core of Link's design is that he's always meant to be relatable and have the player imagine themselves in his shoes, which is why he's one of my favorite protagonists in all of gaming. Not only for the previous point, but because his courage to face evil is something I really admire. Throughout the series, Link has been portrayed in multiple ways, whether it being a child or a young adult. But no matter what interpretation it is, whenever evil arises, Link will always step forward wearing his iconic green clothes and wielding his sword and shield. As for the series' namesake, Princess Zelda, her inspiration came from the wife of author F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote that one book he had to read in high school. During the development of the first game, the working title for Zelda 1 was The Legend of X, because Miyamoto wasn't sure X would stand for. But eventually he chose the name Zelda because of the previous point, and because he liked the name. In the first Zelda game, Zelda served as the damsel in distress, but in later games she became more proactive and oftentimes will aid Link on his journey. And much like Link, she's had multiple incarnations throughout the series. While Link has stayed the same since his inception, Zelda on the other hand has really benefited from her multiple incarnations, because over the years she's managed to gain a lot of character development while serving as the driving force within the story. Finally, there's the series antagonist Ganon, and I'll keep this discussion focused on Zelda 1. In the first game, Ganon is depicted as a large boar-like creature who commands an army of darkness after stealing the Triforce of Power. He is entirely evil and seeks to conquer the world. There's nothing much besides that because his more iconic alter ego Ganondorf wouldn't be introduced until Ocarina of Time. From that point onwards, every subsequent Zelda game followed that setup. Ganon or some other evil being tries to conquer the world and is thwarted by Link and Zelda. Later games would expand upon the world by introducing the different races that inhabit Hyrule, like the Gorons, Zora, Gerudo, Rito, and Kokiri, but for Zelda 1, it's just Link, Zelda, and Ganon. As the first game, Zelda 1 would establish the mythology of the series. In the Kingdom of Hyrule, a golden power existed known as the Triforce, a divine artifact separated into two pieces of power and wisdom. One day, the kingdom was attacked by the Prince of Darkness, Ganon. Leading his evil army, he stole the Triforce of Power in order to conquer the world and plunge it into fear and despair. Princess Zelda, fearing the other Triforce piece falling into Ganon's hands, separated the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 pieces and scattered them across the land. Before being kidnapped, she ordered her loyal nursemaid Impa to seek out a worthy hero with the courage to face Ganon. However, Ganon would send out his minions to intercept Impa, and when she was surrounded, facing imminent demise, a young boy appeared right on time, defeating Ganon's minions with ease. His name was Link. Impa told Link what happened to Princess Zelda, and after hearing her story, decided it was his duty to save the princess and thwart the dark ambitions of Ganon. However, in order to face the Prince of Darkness at his lair in Death Mountain, Link must first gather the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom scattered across the 8 dungeons within Hyrule. Once you name Link and begin the game, Zelda 1 plops you in the middle of a field with no sense of direction, but players paying attention will notice a cave in the top left, and entering it will reward the player with a surprise. It's dangerous to go alone. Take this. Right from the first screen, Zelda 1 is teaching you its most important lesson. A core principle of the Zelda series is exploring to discover secrets. While it's innocent on the surface, might contain a bombable wall or burnable bush that contains hidden items like a heart container or a stash of rupees. The bombs and candle will be your method of discovering secrets, and with bombs you can only carry 8 at a time, but enemies can drop them or they can be purchased as a set of 4 from an item shop. You should always go out of your way to find secrets because a lot of them are mandatory and make your journey a lot easier. As for how well Zelda 1 implemented this, will be made abundantly clear. Upon leaving the cave, I was ready to set out on my journey, and from then on I could go where I pleased. When discussing The Legend of Zelda online, an argument can be made that Zelda 1 could be considered the very first open world game. In the 1980s, there wasn't a game like The Legend of Zelda beforehand. There were old school dungeon crawlers on old PCs in the 70s, however home computers were not common and oftentimes were too complex, requiring a pen and paper during gameplay. A lot of these games were the earliest RPGs or role-playing games, but once the NES released offering simpler games and cheaper prices, the home console market became more popular. When we think of open world games, we think of these massive worlds packed with content and giving the player the freedom to go wherever they want. The best examples are the 3 biggest open world games from the previous decade: Skyrim, The Witcher 3, and Breath of the Wild, all of whom conveniently enough fit into the RPG genre, and in Breath of the Wild's case, is a reimagining of the first game. A lot of players will explore for a bit until they come across the bridge that takes them to the first dungeon, but if you're feeling ballsy, you can ignore the first cave and do a no sword run, which there are plenty you can find on YouTube. Once I left the cave, instead of heading straight to the first dungeon, I decided I wanted to better equip myself for the journey ahead. You control Link using the D-pad, moving him in 4 directions. Your sword is mapped to the A button, and pressing it will cause Link to stab it forward, dealing damage to enemies in front of him. When at full health, Link can shoot a beam from his sword, and it's very useful when dealing with enemies you want to keep your distance from. Link also carries a shield which he uses to defend himself. However, the shield you get at the beginning is only able to block arrows and spears from the weaker moblins, and you'll need to purchase the magical shield from a shop in order to deflect the stronger projectiles. The B button is utilized to use items Link keeps in his inventory. One of the first things I did was to increase Link's total hearts. At the start of every Zelda game, Link begins with 3 hearts, but by collecting heart containers, it'll increase his total HP. The first container I found was the one hidden in a cave at the southern coast, and I shouldn't have to say this, but never, ever take the potion, okay? But once I got the heart container, I made my way up the coast to head to my destination. Unfortunately, I ended up dying. Trying again, I instead took the route through the low part of Death Mountain because it took me to where I needed to go, and I could grab the next heart container along the way. Then I arrived and walked up the hidden stairs to get the 100 rupees from the friendly moblin. From then on, I backtracked and ventured up into Death Mountain and found a shop that sold the blue candle, which was why I wanted the rupees. On the way back, I bombed a hidden wall, and inside was the old woman who the letter was meant for, and showing it to her let me purchase a red potion. Finally, I walked up the stairs where the waterfall is, and entered the cave guarded by a blue Lionel, who I ran past because I knew he would destroy me this early on. Inside was the silver sword, an upgraded sword that deals more damage than the wooden sword. However, in order to obtain it, you'd first have to increase Link's total hearts to 5. Once I obtained the silver sword, I was ready to begin the first dungeon. All of what I've just described can be done before beginning the first dungeon, and judging by that story, I would label Zelda 1 as an open world game. If you have the means, you can even do the dungeons out of order, but it's not recommended because Zelda 1's difficulty is congruent to how far you've progressed. Now, technically speaking, up until the latest two entries, the Zelda series has never been a true open world series. It's more linear action adventure with the spirit of an open world. In a typical Zelda game, you'll have a start and end point. Let's say along the way you come across a secret, except you're unable to go any further unless you have the necessary item. So you decide to return to the path, and eventually you obtain the required item. You backtrack to where you were previously, and are rewarded, usually in the form of a piece of heart. Future games took this process and made it more complicated, but that methodology is how a Zelda game is designed. For a game that was released in 1989, the freedom given to the player to go wherever they want was never heard of by that point, at least done in a more simpler manner. I always appreciate when video games allow the player the agency to decide how their adventure progresses. To be honest, I hate it when video games constantly hold your hand because it feels like the game sees you as an idiot that needs to be told what to do. The reason why I fell in love with the Zelda series is because of the emphasis on exploration and solving puzzles. Exploring the overworld while the main theme plays gets me excited to begin an adventure, and finding a secret accompanied with the iconic jingle feels rewarding for the observational player. Hyrule is designed in a 16x8 rectangle which serves as the overworld. When traveling to another area, it's as simple as moving Link to the edge of the screen and the game transitioning to the adjacent area. Thankfully, it's very easy to distinguish where you are based on the biome. Hyrule is designed to be non-linear, allowing the player to take whatever path they want to their destination. If you want to go to Death Mountain to get the Silver Sword, you could take the coast, but you'd have to avoid the Riversaurs harassing you along the way. Or take Central Hyrule and cut straight through the map. I like to divide Hyrule into distinct regions to help know where I am or what secrets in that area. Central Hyrule is where you'll begin your adventure, and it's full of green fields and forests, as well as the lake that runs through the middle of the map. There's also another lake to the southeast, which I consider to be Lake Hylia. A lot of the secrets you'll find here are hidden in bushes, which require the candle, but thankfully the shops carry them, so getting one isn't too difficult. You just have to be careful which bush you burn, because sometimes you can burn the wrong one and have to pay for the door repair. That's because there are no towns to speak of in Zelda 1. The only NPCs you'll encounter are old men and women in caves, or the occasional friendly moblin. Later lore would specify that this was a time when Hyrule was reduced to a lesser kingdom, in a time without the Triforce. Eastern Hyrule is the coast where you'll encounter the Riversaur, who will peek out from under the water and try to pelt you with fireballs. There are also secret caves where you can play guessing games, but the reason you come here is to get the 2 heart containers and the letter from the old man. Besides that, there isn't much to do on the coast. Death Mountain, by its namesake, is full of death. It's suited at the northernmost part of the map, where you'll fight some of the strongest enemies in the overworld, the Lynels. If you're in this area like I was when I wanted to get the Silver Sword early, be sure to avoid them because they can do a lot of damage when you have low hearts. The base of the mountain also has sections where boulders will drop from above, and they're especially dangerous when you're on stairs because Link's speed is reduced. The best way to avoid them is to make a beeline for the next screen. Finally, there's Western Hyrule. In the southwest lies the Lost Woods, a maze of woods that'll keep repeating until you uncover the correct path. Unfortunately, it doesn't go away once you solve it, but the reason you go through the Lost Woods is to arrive at the graveyard where the 6th dungeon is, and to get the magic sword hidden under a gravestone. Once you complete those, you never have a real reason to return to Western Hyrule, but if you have the stepladder, you can use the river north of the 1st dungeon as a shortcut, that way you don't have to go through the Lost Woods. Zelda 1 would put landmarks to help give you a sense of direction. There's never a feeling of trying to pad out the playtime by including random side content that doesn't add anything to the overall experience, because you're always focused on recovering the Triforce pieces, and for that I think Zelda 1 is a well-paced game. I know if I want to get to the Silver Sword, I have to head to the screen where the waterfall is located and head up the stairs. Or if I want to go to the 1st dungeon, I find the bridge connecting to the island it's located on. If exploring the overworld is one half of Zelda's gameplay, then exploring dungeons is the remaining half. The dungeons are designed to be mazes with the goal of testing the player's combat and puzzle-solving skills. Each dungeon has a unique design representing a different animal, and while it offers different layouts, visually the dungeons look the exact same, only differentiating from each other based on their color palette. A lot of what you learned in the overworld is once again brought over in the dungeons. You have to explore and navigate the numerous corridors to defeat the boss and recover the Triforce piece. However, the dungeons are not designed in a linear fashion, instead they're non-linear, allowing the player to explore. In the Zelda series, every dungeon contains small keys, and obtaining them unlocks doors allowing you to explore deeper in the dungeon. And after using one, you lose it permanently. Keys in Zelda 1 can be found in a room lying on the floor, or by defeating enemies in the room. However, in Zelda 1, any keys you don't use are stored in your inventory, and can be saved to use in later dungeons. Because many of the rooms are entirely optional, this unfortunately is very game-breaking because having spare keys allows you to ignore the entire purpose of exploring. And on top of that, a lot of the later dungeons don't have enough keys to unlock all the doors. You can purchase keys, but they're very expensive, costing 100 rupees a piece. During my playthrough, I would explore every room the dungeon had available, and because of that, I always had a steady reserve of keys available. It's very unrefined because future games would go on to polish what was established in this game. If you do go out of your way to explore, you'll find items that can aid you along your way. The map reveals the layout of the dungeon, and it's displayed on the top left of the screen, but by pausing you can see a more detailed map. The compass is the other item you can pick up, and its only purpose is to show you where the Triforce piece is. The compass isn't very useful in Zelda 1 because it doesn't come with the feature later games introduced of being able to mark the locations of chests. Both of them are exclusive to the dungeon they belong to, so each time you enter a dungeon, you'll have to pick them up every time. But what separates each dungeon besides their design is the unique item hidden inside. A tradition in every Zelda game, every dungeon contains a unique item that you'll have to discover, and once you obtain it, it'll allow Link to overcome new obstacles in his journey. In order to beat the game, it's mandatory that you obtain a majority of the dungeon items, otherwise you'll be unable to progress further. To enter Dungeon 4, you need to get the raft in Dungeon 3 because the raft is used to sail to the island the dungeon is located. Funnily enough, on my playthrough for this review, I accidentally entered the boss room too early before I could get the raft, and after obtaining the Triforce piece, I had to venture back inside to get the raft. Some items are either weapons Link can use like the boomerang in Dungeon 1 or the magic rod in Dungeon 6, but others like the magic book and magic key found in Dungeon 8 will give passive status effects. I did say a majority of the items were mandatory because technically the Book of Magic and Magic Key are optional, but the former gives an upgrade to the magic rod, and meanwhile the magic key lets you open doors indefinitely. The former you should always get because it makes the final dungeon much easier. At the end of every dungeon, there's always a boss you have to defeat before being rewarded with the Triforce piece. The boss strategies can range from attacking them repeatedly with Link's sword, or by using a specific item which they're weak to. This is why you have to explore and find the dungeon's item. Take Dungeon 5's boss, the Dogger. In Dungeon 5 lies the flute. By equipping it, Link will play a melody that appears to do nothing. However, by playing it when fighting the boss, the Dogger will split into smaller fragments letting you deal damage, because otherwise, he's invincible in his larger form. The idea of using the dungeon's item against the boss would become another staple of the Zelda series. Sometimes Zelda 1 likes to reuse certain bosses because you'll be refighting Aqua Mentis 2 times, and in later dungeons, some of the bosses end up becoming normal enemies, which is a cool way of showing Link is becoming stronger the further in his journey he is. The bosses are nothing special to be honest because most of them can be defeated just by using your sword. In the Zelda series, there are always two philosophies competing over the dungeon design: linear versus non-linear dungeons. If you've seen boss keys on YouTube, you'll know in the 2D Zelda titles, a lot of the dungeons follow the lock and key method, meaning that in order to progress further into the dungeon, you have to obtain the necessary key to unlock the door you need to head down. In the context of Zelda 1 invented this methodology. Let's use Dungeon 1 as an example. When you enter, you're presented with 3 paths. The way upwards is locked, but the left and right path isn't. So you decide to head left, and you discover a key you pick up. Okay, so now you can unlock the door to the north and progress further. However, there's a door to the right that's still open. So you decide to explore there as well. Inside, there are a group of enemies, and one of them is holding a key. So, you defeat all the enemies and obtain another key. Now you have one key to open the door and another key on standby. When you enter the next room, you find that you can only go north, so with nowhere else to go, you head down the only available path. The next room gives you the option of going left or right. Heading right will be where the compass is located, and grabbing it reveals the location of the Triforce piece. So now you're presented with a choice of heading straight for the boss or exploring further. Let's say with nowhere else to go, you decide to go back and head left. But what if I told you the room with the compass contains a bombable wall that you can use as a shortcut to go straight to the boss? And the room before also has a bombable wall allowing you to avoid having to go the long way. If your goal is to min-max, then bombing the wall is your best option. Heading all the way to the left will be an old man who will give you a hint. So essentially, Zelda 1 offers 2 ways to get to your destination. The later titles would establish the central room design where it serves as the hub of the dungeon. Now that you have the compass, you could go face the boss to finish the dungeon, but what's interesting is that right before the boss room you'll find the map, and it reveals that there's more to explore within the dungeon. Exploration being essential in Zelda 1, heading north will have you defeat 2 rooms full of enemies, and once you get to the end, you find a set of stairs taking you to where the bow is. Finally, you backtrack to where you were, grab the boomerang, defeat Aqua Mentis, and finish the dungeon. The key takeaway I wanted you to understand was that in the examples given, Zelda 1 allowed me to explore the dungeon at my own leisure. In Zelda 1, the non-linear design allows for the observant and curious player to find creative ways to reach their objective. It's not perfect because the only way to know if the wall was bombable was to experiment. The puzzles, and I put that in quotes, boil down to defeating the enemies and pushing a block. But either way, the spirit of exploring and finding secrets is still preserved. I'm not trying to debate which format is better because both have their own merits. and I'll be sure to go over when I discuss the linear dungeons one day. Now throughout the video I've been praising Zelda 1 for its exploration, its dungeons, and its overall gameplay. However, we've now entered the ugly part of the video. To confess, everything I've discussed up until this point would not have been possible without the aid of a guide. When critically analyzed, many people consider Zelda 1 to be what's called a guide game. What that means is that in order to play Zelda 1 in a timely and effective manner, you should consult a guide during your playthrough. While you're meant to explore everywhere you go, the tedium occurs when you're unable to determine what to do next. Take the overworld for example. I know I've mentioned it up until now, but that map on the top left of the screen is completely fucking worthless. Looking at the gameplay, you've noticed that whenever I bomb a hidden cave, there's never an indication or hint that the wall is destructible. Because all the walls look the same, you have to use a guide to find the right one. Another thing I'll mention is that because you can only carry 8 bombs at a time, you have to always be conservative with their use to make sure you have enough to find that one cave carrying a heart container, or the path required to progress in a dungeon. Zelda 1 does give you hints, but oftentimes they're cryptic and meant for a specific scenario. Even though I did praise Zelda 1's overworld for its non-linearity, without the aid of a guide, you can be left wandering the overworld unsure where you need to go. A lot of the early dungeons can be found in the overworld, and they're not too hard to find. It's when you get to the endgame dungeons that they get more inconspicuous. Take Dungeon 7. To enter Dungeon 7, you have to find the fairy flute within Dungeon 5. If you explore all of Dungeon 6, you'll encounter an old man who tells you to play the flute where fairies do not gather. Okay, well I know that fairies are found at specific ponds in the overworld, so going off of what I know, I need to find a pond that doesn't have a fairy. And lo and behold, a pond to the west doesn't have a fairy. So I play the flute, and as a result, the pond is drained, revealing the entrance to Dungeon 7. I'll give Zelda 1 credit. The game does give you a hint. However, like the dungeon items, they're missable. If the player doesn't find the old man, then they're left confused as to what to do next. It's one example of why having a guide is essential, because on a first playthrough, how are you supposed to know that? Speaking of hints, a lot of the hints are either cryptic or straight up confusing to say the least. I'm curious to know how much the translation from Japanese to English played a role in this, because translating one language to the other isn't as direct as some people think. One of the most iconic lines to come out of this game is, "The dongos don't like smoke," which is meant to indicate the boss of Dungeon 2 is weak to bombs, because after all, the smoke is meant to reference the fuse from the bomb. But then you get other hints like, 10th enemy has the bomb, which is like, what? The most infamous secret, however, is the Grumble Grumble moblin in Dungeon 7. You're supposed to purchase the food from the shop and use it to pass through. Again, how are you supposed to know that without a guide? They could have at least changed the text to "I'm hungry" or something like that. What's funny is that during the localization of Zelda 1, Nintendo of America included a lot of hints in the manual to try and help players who otherwise would have been left dry. It's so ironic that even Nintendo themselves knew that Zelda 1 requires a guide to beat. It's interesting to ponder how players back in the 80s dealt with Zelda 1's cryptic guidance, because we live in a time where pulling up a guide on Zelda Dungeon can be done without any contemplation. Honestly, because a guide is essential, it really leaves a bad stain to Zelda 1's legacy. That doesn't mean I didn't have a good time with Zelda 1. Once I got enough heart containers on my way to Dungeon 5, I made a detour to the graveyard, and instead of heading through the Lost Woods, I used the stepladder to take a shortcut at the base of Death Mountain. At the graveyard, by pushing a specific headstone, it'll reveal a secret staircase where the magic sword is hidden, and because I had the required hearts, I was worthy to wield it. I love the magic sword in this game because it'll one-shot low-level enemies completely. The blue ring was also another upgrade I got by purchasing it from a secret shop northwest of Dungeon 4. It was a heavy price, costing a total of 250 rupees, which mind you, Link can only carry a total of 255 rupees. You take reduced damage, and in my opinion, you should always get it during your playthrough. It comes in especially useful when fighting the blue Dark Nuts, or, blue Wizrobes. Speaking of Dark Nuts and Wizrobes, these guys are some of the worst you'll encounter in this game. When fighting Dark Nuts, their bodies are entirely protected by their armor, meaning that frontal attacks are completely useless. The only place they're vulnerable is their back, except because Zelda 1's combat is very janky, oftentimes you're running around them while trying to avoid damage. Bombs are a good way of doing damage, but because you fight them exclusively in dungeons, you always have to remember to keep an eye on your bomb count. This happened twice, to the point where I had to leave the dungeon to buy more bombs. Now, I shouldn't have been reckless with my bombs. It sucks that even the magic rod doesn't work, and that's with the magic book upgrade that emits fire. After all, it should burn them in their armor. However, the Wizrobes are much worse. The orange variants are not bad. They're easily beaten with one hit from the magic sword. It's the blue variant that causes the most trouble. How they work is that they'll teleport around the room and take shots at Link, then immediately teleport away. Even with the blue ring, when hit, Wizrobes will deal 3 hearts worth of damage, and then knockback can sometimes cause you to get hit by another Wizrobe. By the time I was facing them, I already had the magic sword, but would you believe that even the magic sword, the best sword in the game, needs 3 hits to defeat a blue Wizrobe? Worst of all, the game loves to fill rooms with packs of dark nuts and Wizrobes, forcing you to fend for your life or chug a potion, sometimes even in the dark. They also love to put anti-fairies in your way, and if you make contact with them, Link will become cursed, being unable to use his sword. Anti-fairies only exist to complicate your problems. Ballmasters are another nuisance because if they grab Link, they'll return him to the dungeon's entrance. I remember when I was heading to Dungeon 5, I wanted to investigate the waterfall after hearing the hint from the old man. Heading inside, thanks to the raft, I found an old woman who offered a hint for a price. After paying, she told me to go up the mountain because that was the solution to solving Death Mountain's puzzle. To be honest, after leaving, I felt like I got ripped off because you can just brute force the puzzle. I also found a lot of items were incredibly useful during my adventure. The boomerang is one of my favorite Zelda items because it's able to stun enemies, making them vulnerable for a brief period of time. The first boomerang does come with limited range, however in Dungeon 2 you'll find the magic boomerang that's able to go as far as the end of the screen. It was hands down my favorite item, not only because of its stun, but because it saved me multiple times against like-likes from eating my shield. The bow on the other hand is really strange because after finding it in Dungeon 1, you have to purchase the arrows in an item shop. However, Zelda 1 uses your rupees as arrows, which I'm assuming was done out of programming limitations. Either way, you have to treat your rupees like currency and arrows, which is interesting to say the least. I said this before, but always get the magic key in Dungeon 8, and fun fact, the A stands for Almighty, so there's your fun Zelda fact. Once you have the magic key and obtain the 8th Triforce piece, you're ready to face Ganon. To enter Ganon's lair, you have to venture into Death Mountain and bomb the entrance at Spectacle Rock. Now I won't lie and say Ganon's lair is a gauntlet of a final dungeon, and you can easily get lost during your playthrough. It's why it's essential that you get the magic key before entering, because while you can beat the dungeon without it, you have to make sure you use what keys you find on the right doors, because like with some of the previous dungeons, there aren't enough available keys to unlock every door. You also have to make sure that you get the silver arrows before facing Ganon, because they're mandatory in dealing the final blow. Again, using a guide for this dungeon is essential. Once you arrive at his chamber, Link will raise the Triforce of Wisdom, unveiling Ganon. During the final battle, Ganon will be invisible and teleport around the map. Your job is to hit him enough times and eventually he'll become vulnerable, allowing you to finish him off with the silver arrows. Ganon will be reduced to ashes, revealing the Triforce of Power. Once Link recovers the Triforce, the door to Princess Zelda's chamber is unlocked, and after she's freed, Link and Zelda with both pieces of the Triforce return peace to Hyrule. Zelda also mentions the second quest, but I'll be honest, I've never attempted it once. In conclusion, The Legend of Zelda created the RPG genre with its non-linearity, exploration, and secrets. The Legend of Zelda established the series in becoming one of Nintendo's AAA franchises. While it was revolutionary for the time, a lot of its mechanics were unpolished, and as a result make the game difficult to return to without the assistance of a guide. Even though The Legend of Zelda wasn't my first time with the series, completing the first game to one of my favorite franchises was still a privilege to experience. The next time I return to Zelda, it'll be Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Thank you for watching, and take care.